2017 Polaris RZR 900 EPS trail model, 50-inch. So I've got a box of goodies that showed up the other day. It's a rear bumper cage unit, which also has a luggage rack built into it. Big box, heavy box, with lots of bubble wrap. And lots of hardware. So it bolts down there by the hitch, comes up, and then also has two vertical bars that bolt in right there and right there. And then we've got an intermediate rack that sits kind of high and gives you a place to store cargo, chainsaw, box with goodies in it, stuff, cooler, whatever. And then it also has a spare tire rack. And the spare tire rack is a bolt-on assembly, and you don't have to install that. So let's get busy. I bet the instructions are in that little box right there. There they are, along with a bunch of hardware. And that's the spare tire rack. So I've got everything unboxed. We've inventoried all of our parts. We've got the two upright bars. They're actually labeled right and left. Here's our spare tire mount. Here's our two clamps that go around the tube. They bolt up to this piece. All of our hardware is neatly laid out and accounted for. I kind of laid it out like the instruction sheet shows, and it describes which each grouping of hardware is for. And then we've got our lower section. That's the bumper assembly is what they call that. Looks fairly straightforward to install. Shouldn't take too long. Tools required: 3/8 socket short extension, 13mm socket to attach the bolts to the upper cage, the tubes that attach to the top of the cage, 15mm socket, that's what goes on the bolts down at the bottom of the bumper assembly, 13mm wrench, 17mm wrench. This is for the nuts on the rack. This is for the nuts that attach the tube assembly to the bumper just above the side of the bed or the back of the bed. And then we've got a 6mm hex drive. This is also for the bolts, the hex head bolts that attach the tubes to the bumper. And then we have an 8mm hex drive. This is what is used on the bolts for the rack. This section of the instructions talks about the fact that they've included two sets of hardware for your upper tubes, where they bolt into the top part of the cage assembly. It says depending on where your RZR was manufactured, it could be one of two thread pitches. They've included both sets of bolts, both thread pitches, so they've described the fact that you need to take one or the other and thread them in. So it's these bolts right here, and I've got to pick up one of each. I've got my coarse thread on the left and my fine thread on the right. Looking in the hole there, it kind of looks like it's going to be the fine thread, so I'll start with that. Well, it doesn't thread in very well. Could be just that there's a lot of powder coat on the inside of the threads. I don't know. Neither one of those go in very far. I think I'll get a flashlight and shine in that hole and take a peek and see what we're looking at for thread. I found a thread pitch gauge in my tap and die set and thought that would be a lot more effective way to determine what our thread pitch is. Fine thread pitch is 1.25. Coarse thread pitch is 1.5. I can't hold the camera and the flashlight and the thread pitch gauge all at the same time because I've only got two hands, but I've already held my flashlight up here and the thread pitch gauge, and we are definitely the coarse threads in that hole. So I've set the fine pitch thread bolts aside and get busy with installing the lower section first. The instructions recommend two people so that you can have one person hold this assembly while the other person starts the bolt. I'm doing it alone because I don't have a helper, and I've got a 15mm socket with a short extension on it. Gives me a better hand hold on that bolt to get it started. But even at that, I'm having a little bit of difficulty. There we go. I had already threaded these bolts in part way just to make sure that there wasn't a bunch of powder coat gumming up the threads. I'm just going to snug these bolts down. We might have to make some minor adjustments getting the other tubes to fit. In fact, the instructions say on all of the hardware not to tighten it down all the way until you're finished with everything. I have skipped one step on the instructions. I am not going to install the tire carrier. It does say to install the tire carrier first because it's easier to install the tire carrier when the bumper is not mounted on the RZR yet. I don't need the tire carrier right away, so that's why I've opted to leave it off for the time being. My upper tube sections were marked wrong. The tube that's labeled for the right is actually for the left. My first clue to that was, I thought, okay, if this is going on the right, that's facing the inside. That's not right. That's left. And I read the instructions more, and it describes that these mounting tabs for the shelf do face towards the inside, towards the middle of the machine. I also knew that on a friend's machine that this label, or this little laser engraved logo, faces out. So this, I've already test fit it, and this is definitely the right side. So I've got my bolts down there ready to go. Before installing the upper tubes, you might check these two welds. See that silver spot there? That was kind of an ugly weld, and there was quite a bit of material protruding away from this flat flange, so it was preventing the upper tube flange from fully tightening up against that fitting. I filed it off and cleaned it up pretty good. Left side bar is mounted. I don't have the hardware tightened down much yet. Right side, I'm going to try this one a little bit different. I've started the bolts there, and instead of allowing this piece to flop around while I'm trying to tighten the bolts, I've put one bolt in here with the nut on the bottom. And the bolt goes in through the hole, obviously, and then you put your washer in there first and then the nut. Reading our instructions for the shelf, it says the shelf can only be installed in one direction, is narrow at the rear than the front. Use a tape measure to determine which side is the front. I've already measured this. The side facing me is 26.5. The side facing away from me is 26 3/4. So the side facing me is the rear, 26.5. I've put my hardware in the bed, and I've placed the 2 bolts on the left in the holes, and I'm holding them in place with some blue painter's tape. Again, this is one of those portions of this process that's going to be a little bit more challenging, not having a helper. Mounting the shelf didn't go too bad. I have a small step ladder here. I just climbed up on the step ladder holding the shelf. You can see the hardware down there. I picked up the 2 bolts for this side, put my foot in the bed here to give myself a little better footing, and just slipped it right into place, and then installed these other 2 bolts. So now I'll go ahead and get the nuts and washers and install them. To prevent scratches on the upper tube assemblies, I've put a piece of the foam packing material around the tube. That's going to keep my ratchet from scratching up the powder coat finish. So I'll just use the ratchet on top, and then my 13mm box-in wrench on the bottom. Tighten up the top bolts with the 13mm socket and your 3/8 ratchet. The last step of the project is to tighten up the bolts that hold the rack in place. 17mm wrench and our 8mm hex drive, or Allen wrench if that's all you've got. And looking at our hardware, our bolts kind of stick into our cargo area a little bit. I may take those off and swap them end for end so our nut is on the outside. That way, if we've got a wide piece of cargo that happens to slide back and forth at all, it's not going to shred itself on the bolts. Here's an overview. I've gotten everything installed, all the bolts tightened down. 2 bolts there mount that bumper plate around the hitch. Overall, the project probably would have only taken an hour had I not been making this video. Everything fit really well. I didn't have any fitment issues at all. The only minor issue I've encountered is that one of the nuts that hold the bottom end of the top tube to the bumper is missing its little nylon insert. I did go ahead and change the orientation of the bolts that hold the rack in, so I've got the head of the bolt facing inside. I'll probably go to the hardware store tomorrow and pick up some rubber caps to cover up the ends of those bolts. But very nice rack, bumper, cage assembly. It's really nice. I forgot to pull those end protectors off. This is how the spare tire mount is oriented. You can tell that with the spare tire in place, it would block some of your rearward visibility. I'm just holding it here because I'm not going to install it, but you've got the other half of this tube clamp that fits on the back side, and 2 bolts on the top, 2 bolts on the bottom, and on the bottom clamp you've also got 2 more bolts. It actually doesn't look like it'll be too bad installing this after the fact when I do get a spare tire. The bolts down here on the bottom are accessible sort of pretty much from the bottom. Not too bad accessibility on the lower bolts here too. We do have a little bit of access space between the top of the bed and that bottom tube. Down there in my collection of hardware, there's 4 nuts that hold the tire in place, and then those other 8 bolts are what hold the clamps in place for the spare tire mount. All in all, a very nice rack. All in all, it's a very nice addition to the RZR. It gains some bumper and rear bed protection, a little bit of a roll cage extension. I don't know if it's safety rated or not. It may not be, but anything helps. And then a fairly nice rack as well.